So welcome back, everybody. We're going to head up to the next talk here. I'm going to welcome Dr. Regan Bailey. Dr. Bailey is Associate Institute Director for the Institute of Advanced Health through Agriculture and Professor of Nutrition at Texas A&M University. Dr. Bailey also served on the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Committee, so has a lot of insight. She's going to be sharing her insights on the development of indices and metrics for evaluating dietary patterns through the lens of the DGAC experience. Dr. Bailey.
As John mentioned, I think the biggest conflict of interest is I am a former member of the 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. You can see I've been involved with ILSI North America for a number of years. I think those are the highlights. There's some jokes on there, but... Okay, so I'm not going to be like a graduate student and give you the outline and then tell you what I'm going to tell you, but I would just want to look at this figure because it's going to seem like, hey, she's starting here and she's all over the place. I will eventually get to the pink point, I promise you. So first, let's start with dietary classifications. Largely can be based nutrient or foods. So nutrients are often examined in isolation. This is a very much like a DRI approach. This is foundational for understanding how mechanisms work. Lots of positives. The negatives of this is it's very narrowly focused. We all just don't eat. You get up in the morning and have a great big bowl of zinc, right? I mean, I don't. Maybe you do. If you do, that's okay. I'm not judging you. But the way that nutrients interact in our body, there's synergies, there's interactions, and so this one nutrient, one outcome does have some limitations. And because Linda Tapsell is one of the kindest people in the world, I put this quote up here instead of saying it myself. So this is why when we're interested in health as the outcome, we really need to focus on foods and the diet rather than nutrients. Having said that, I am a micronutrient person. So we're going to move on to foods-based approaches, namely dietary patterns. This is the definition. It's so old that it was written when NESR was the Nutrition Evidence Library. NESR, I still don't understand, but Nutrition Evidence Library made more sense to me, but I'm going to let it go. So as I mentioned, diet's very complicated. We have this multi-dimensional diet. If you have cereal, you often have milk on your cereal. These combinations of foods that are often represented together. It's not just what you eat, but when you're eating it. There's a lot of collinearity of certain nutrients. They travel together in certain foods. And patterns really allow you to account for substitution effects. There's been very positive. This is probably the greatest success stories in nutrition, right? In terms of dietary patterns, is the DASH diet and Predimed. They really move the needle. So we know that this works if a whole patterns approach is taken from research perspective. And then finally, what we're here today to talk about is how this informs the dietary guidelines. I don't know, we're all mainly in nutrition here, so nothing is ever all positive. And, you know, there's always some downsides to anything. So patterns are great, but they're not perfect because they rely on self-reported dietary data, which we know is notoriously fraught with measurement error. Oftentimes, what we're concerned about is energy underreporting. So how does energy underreporting influence the derivation of patterns? Again, we're all in nutrition. There's no yes or no. It depends. So we published a paper with Diane, who's sitting here, a long time ago, that in a very homogeneous group that had very stable dietary patterns, it didn't matter if you included or excluded the energy underreporters. But the more diverse your population is, the impact will change how patterns are derived. And so this is another reference that I'm giving you, but you can see that for the healthy pattern they derived, not a problem. But changes were when the pattern was called mixed or Western. And so remember that I did air quotes, not bunnies. So I told people if I go on a tangent, do bunnies. So I did an air quote. I wasn't bunnying myself. Okay. And a lot of the early patterns research were focused around food frequency questionnaires, which aggregate foods with similar nutrient profiles. So if you're really interested in understanding which particular food, this is a major limitation, and why you should always have, and there's a limited number of questions you can ask on a food frequency questionnaire. So that's another limitation. And I have in green that if you're going to use a food frequency questionnaire, it should be population specific. You can't ask culturally diverse, age diverse, neurodiverse people the same exact questions. It has to be population specific if you're going to use an FFQ. Another limitation is there's a lot of subjective decisions that need to be made when deriving the patterns statistically. And I say they are not uniformly named by investigators. And that's why I said, remember Western. What's Western in one publication looks very different than what's Western in another. Same with the Mediterranean diet. Looks very different paper to paper, which makes it very hard to synthesize the evidence. I don't know what a prudent diet is. I've used the word prudent diet. I don't even know what that means. And even though you have a Western and a prudent diet, the differences between them may be very small. It may be 1/10 of a cup of a vegetable, and this is a Western and this is a prudent. And so that's another thing that you really need to look at when you're evaluating this type of literature. And I mentioned the positive interventions from clinical trials, but are these realistic in a real-world setting? If somebody made me 3 meals a day for 2 weeks, I would marry them. Even though I have a husband that I love, is it really realistic to ask people to eat this way? Dash, 8 to 10 servings of fruits and vegetables, when we know that the average American has a discrete or on-purpose serving of a vegetable at around 1 to 1.5 per day. So we're really far from that 8 to 10. And so, while it has been positive, is it realistic? Is it scalable? Adam, is it affordable? I mean, do people have access to these types of approaches that we're recommending for them? So we're going to get in the weeds for a minute, and this is going to be an age test. Does anybody know what this logo is? The yellow. Okay, so this is the yellow pages. You let your fingers do the walking. So this is called outcome-independent methods to derive dietary patterns. Outcome-dependent methods are more like the Stephen Covey. You begin with the end in mind. Cardiovascular disease, we're interested in that. We go into the dietary data and we find the optimal combination of foods that explains the most variation and risk of cardiovascular disease. We don't have time to talk about that today, but it's really, really interesting work. So factor and cluster analysis were really the first gen method for deriving dietary patterns. Factor analysis groups foods together, that's a pattern. Cluster analysis groups people together that have a similar pattern. As I mentioned, given all these subject decisions that have to be made, it's basically meaningless when you're trying to evaluate the evidence. It's very useful within your research to do multiple different types of these to see if you can replicate them. And the National Cancer Institute has a Dietary Patterns Methods project that does just this. It looks at all of these types of approaches to make sure that you get consistency across. You don't want to publish this diet as associated with colorectal cancer if you can't reproduce that in various ways. And the next outcome-independent method, and the last one, I promise you because I know we're in the weeds, is indices and scores. And so these are developed basically, like I tell my students, this is like a report card. How well are you doing in each of these areas? And so you are probably very familiar with the Healthy Eating Index, the Mediterranean Diet Score, the DASH Diet Score, but you can see they're all scored differently. So the HEI is 0 to 100. The DASH diet score is up to 40 points. And so while indexes and scores are great because then you can compare apples to apples to apples across cohorts, there is still some subjective decision making that goes into how things are weighted. And, you know, are some of these things relevant to diverse groups? This is a terrible example, but the original Mediterranean diet score had a category for sofrita, which is a condiment that's used in Mediterranean countries. So that's not something that's applicable. So is it relevant? No. So the alternative Mediterranean diet score began, but there's a lot of politics behind that. But that's just a bad example. But not all of these indexes are, I'm saying indexes are great, but you don't want to take a Mediterranean diet index and do research in a country that doesn't have access to that type of food. Limitations. So in 2015 is really, this Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee said that using indexes and scores are the optimal way to classify dietary patterns for informing dietary guidance. In 2020, I was part of this committee. We extended that to include different life stages. So you don't need just one diet pattern your whole life. At different points in your life, you may need different types of patterns to support the nutrients for growth, for development, pregnancy, lactation, what have you. And still, the number one guideline is follow a healthy dietary pattern at any age. I'm getting there. See, now we're going to start to talk about ultra-processed foods, but just for a minute, because I don't know very much about them. So I love this planning committee because it's so complementary, but it's not overlapping. So this is just showing you that there are many different ways to classify foods, as we've heard. Nova's, you know, the Madonna of this kind of thing, but there's no definition that everyone agrees on. There was a Supreme Court justice who said, well, I can't define it, but I know what it is when I see it. And that's kind of what ultra-processed food is. And if you want to know what the topic was, ask me after a cocktail. Much like Connie presented early this morning, a lot of foods that are considered ultra-processed are key contributors to nutrients, no more so than in U.S. adolescents who have the lowest diet quality and have a very limited dietary diversity. And so without these ultra-processed foods, what would the already abhorrent diets look like? All right, let's now move on to dietary guidelines for Americans. This isn't our first rodeo. We're on the 11th edition, but you can see the complexity of how this changes as nutrition science evolves. I'm just going to quickly go through this for anyone who's not familiar. This is how the dietary guidelines are formed. Charter is filed. A committee is nominated and formed. And I need to update this slide and say exclusively scrutinized in the media. And now in scientific literature, right? There's actual published papers on this. I mean, I received hate mail. Memes were made out of me, mainly from my mom, but I'm just kidding. And then think about this in terms of ultra-processed food. The only time the entire committee can get together and talk is when every single member is present. Literally sitting on a theater stage, this is where we were, theater lights on you. Nobody agrees on what the definition of ultra-processed foods are. It's so polarizing. Everybody's probably going to be like, you know, because if you say something, the screenshots are taken, your words are taken out of context in this world that we live in. So it's very difficult to make progress. It's very different than the way the National Academy of Medicine meetings are held. It's just the way that it is. So then the group of scientists write a report. This report was so big this time. My chapter, the first chapter, was over 100 pages, 1.5 space. just one of the chapters. I mean, it's massive, massive amounts of work on everybody who's involved. So basically, we write this report and then we send it to USDA and HHS. They can agree with whatever we say, they can disagree. 98% of what we said in the report were translated into the policy documents. But the media covers the 2% that it didn't align. And there were very good reasons why they didn't align. So they didn't change the added sugar and they didn't adopt the alcohol recommendation. But nobody focuses on the 98% agreement, which is the 2% disagreement. And then these are implemented. And so it's not just through federal programs at the USDA, but it's health and behavior programs at CDC. The last chapter are research gaps and opportunities. And ideally, this is written so that funding agencies can leverage those and issue funding opportunities so that researchers can go out and do the research that needs to be done to fill these gaps. Again, after a glass of wine, ask me how I feel about that. Now, Connie said from her time on the committee, the whole grain intake in the U.S. has gone up. And that is true. It's still not where we want it to be. But I don't think it's because people are eating differently. I think it's because of innovation in the food industry. More and more products are using whole grains instead of refined grains. And so this has widespread, the dietary guidelines have widespread implications beyond just food programs. Okay, so now we're going to quickly go through systematic reviews and how those inform policy and decision makers. First, I'm going to talk only on 2 slides about a brand new center. And this is at Texas A&M University. This is called AFNAC. If acronyms get any worse, I don't know, AFNAC. We just call it AFLAC because it sounds so much like it. So we recruited Amanda McFarland, who I'm sure many of you know from Health Canada, so which is kind of like a hybrid of FDA and NIH. So she has a lot of policy experience. And the dietary guidelines look at diet and the health outcome. By mandate, they're not allowed to look at the environmental impacts, and they're not charged with looking at the economic impacts for growers, producers. This center will focus on all 3 of those areas at once. And I forgot that I always think I'm going to take my joke slides out, and then I don't. This is completely independent. Everybody who works at this center is on hard 12-month salaries. So they're not taking contracts that they don't want. So it's more independent. Some have criticized, not me, because I do not hold this opinion, but some have criticized that the USDA is involved in the systematic review, but then they're also translating it into the policy, and there could be some conflicts of interest there. The USDA is completely transparent in everything they do. I'm going to show you in painful detail how transparent they are. So in addition to doing reviews, they're also the AFLAC is going to focus on new technologies. I'd tell you about it, but then you might steal it and have a better idea. And also fostering collaboration and consensus, not just in the US, but globally. So we just recently visited with WHO and FAO so that we all are aligned on how we do systematic reviews in these different spaces, you know, across the whole ag value chain. All right, so back to America. As you know, the specific question that we're all talking about today is what is the role of ultra-processed foods, and these are the particular endpoints of interest. So growth, body weight, etc. John mentioned this morning that they have 3 choices. The committee has 3 choices. You can answer your question in one of 3 ways. The only way they can answer this question is through systematic reviews. And Dr. Julio Baggi, who is in charge of NESR, who also happened to be a Penn Stater for all of you in the room, and lived in my apartment building and babysat my daughter. This is where you give me the bunny. For free. I had a night class. It was a single mom, and she used to babysit for free. So she's a wonderful person, but she gave me these slides. So I'll go through them really quickly because I want to show you how transparent this process is. Obviously, you get a question, you develop a protocol, and this isn't done in isolation. The committee, the scientific committee, and the federal staff it's like a marriage. Like, you know, I meet you on a first day, and now we're married for the next, year and a half. So this is the process. You develop a protocol. And John apparently had a hand on the protocol for ultra-processed foods, which would have been really helpful for me to know before this. Talk with you about that later. But everything is decided ahead of time so that there are no, so it's very transparent. And these are all publicly available, and there's a chance for public comment each and every way. You can either comment online or you can go to selected meetings. Then an analytical framework is developed. And so I have these highlighted because think about this in terms of ultra-processed foods. What is the comparator? If you look across all 5 of those schemes for classifying foods, almost everything we eat, it would be very hard to have a diet that doesn't have any processing in whatsoever. So how are you going to compare those? So this is an analytical framework, and what's new is a synthesis plan. So this is all laid out ahead of time. So in terms of this example, I put this in mainly because Julie gave it to me, but because I knew Connie was going to be here, and she loves bones. So across the life stage, looking at this, picking up for where we said we have to look at this as a life stage approach. So that's novel, but also the way this synthesis is organized is presented a priori and listed online. So again, very transparent. There's specific inclusion and exclusion criteria for studies to make them relevant. So for each and every study, for each and every study on my left, all of this is reported. But then for certain questions, the committee, scientific committee, can make decisions on what they want. And for example, there was, during my reign of terror on the committee, one of the questions was, what's the relationship with frequency of eating and body weight and all these other health outcomes? They decided that they wanted to include, they had to have 3 different dietary assessments to make sure that the number of eating occasions was stable. So they came back with 0 hits. There was nothing for them to synthesize. They were like, oh. And then meanwhile, you know, I'm on the seafood and fat and cardiovascular disease. I mean, I had like binders and binders of papers to read. So I'm not angry about that at all, which you can clearly tell. So to make it relevant to the U.S. Population, they exclude studies that are not from a similar human development index. Stronger study designs are in the inclusion criteria, things that you would expect. This is where a lot of controversy and miscommunication occurred and a lot of that negative press. There's a lot of people on social media saying Americans are not healthy. Why does the dietary guidelines only look at studies with healthy people? That is not true. Studies are excluded if it's exclusively in a diseased population. Oh my God, I have 1 minute. I never go over. So that's a detail. I can tell you that later. It's really, oh my God, I can't believe I went over time. But I have 30 minutes. All right, anyway, these are all online. If you really want to get in the weeds, they make a conclusion statement. They give it a thing. Connie, you developed evidence scans for DRIs. They're now going to do this for questions that are posed so that you don't go too far down the road. Research needs in general, multiple measurements, standardization of terms and tools. How do we do that for ultra-processed foods? I hope we have a dialogue around that soon. Look at the list of covariates and all of the existing NESR frameworks. If you're a researcher, even if you've collected the data and published it in an old paper, put it in an appendix. Simple information that a study may be included or excluded. We need to think about more than just what people are eating, but what they have access to, their agency. So the whole multi-level social ecological determinants of food choice. I have all the ohms and all the omics because even if we had perfect dietary assessment, each one of us, if we were exposed to a different food, would have a different metabolic response. And there are no indices that account for micronutrients for supplements. So I'll just tell you in a tweet, I fixed it. It worked. Great. And unlike the dietary guidelines, the DRIs don't change every 5 years. So I'll just show you how I fixed it. Everybody gets a score from 0 to 100 on each of these nutrients, and then you take the average of that, and it gives you what their nutrient profile is. This is a framework. You could adopt this to any nutrients you want, any food components you want. It worked. We validated it. Blah, blah, blah. Summary. Okay, I promise I will not go over time. Dietary patterns are really important. Using indexes are really important if you want your work to be meaningful for the dietary guidelines. How complicated is this for ultra-processed foods? So thank you for having me here, but thank you for having this discussion to help the committee as they deliberate. And I'll end with this quote from somebody else who no one ever can get mad at. When we focus on one particular dietary component or aspect of a diet, we really lose a lot of information. So I'd like to thank my graduate student, Alex, who always makes beautiful slides for me. And there's my Twitter handle, or, you know, I just Google me. There's 2 Reagan Baileys in the U.S. So, all right, thank you.